everyone, my name is Ashton Gleckman and welcome to the Season 3 premiere of Behind the Score for Hans Zimmer's Interstellar. Today we're going to be looking at multiple elements of the soundtrack, including the origins of the score, the people involved, the recording locations, the thematic material, instrumentation, and of course a look into the organ. And I've selected a few cues from the movie, including Dreaming of the Crash, the opening cue. We have Chasing Drone, we have Combines Went Haywire, Docking, No Time for Caution / Mountains, Message from Home, which I also like to call the Saturn cue. We have Stay, and then the finale cue of the soundtrack, Quantifiable Connection. So we're going to be looking at the orchestration, the harmony, and everything involved in these cues from the ground up. And as usual, if you guys want to follow along with today's video, you guys can download the MIDI file, the stems, and the Cubase file for free down below in the pinned comment. And there's also going to be all the time codes listed for the various chapters within the video. So without further ado, thanks so much for stopping by, and here's the suite. Interstellar follows the story of a man named Cooper, a widowed engineer and a former NASA pilot who runs a farm with his father-in-law Donald, son Tom, and daughter Murphy. The film opens in the mid-21st century where crop blights and dust storms threaten humanity's survival. After encountering a gravitational anomaly which reveals mysterious GPS coordinates, Cooper comes across a secret NASA facility headed by Cooper's former supervisor, John Brand. Brand explains that NASA has discovered a wormhole near Saturn that leads to another solar system in a distant galaxy where life may be possible. Cooper realizes that he must embark on this mission to try to save mankind as well as his family. Interstellar is filled with brilliantly executed visuals, stellar direction, incredible performances, a truly powerful script, and a visceral score. One of the things that makes Interstellar a true work of cinematic art is while the film spans across galaxies, planets, and even dimensions, it's Cooper's relationship with his family, and specifically his daughter Murph, that function as the true heart of the movie. And it's this element that makes the score as powerful as it is. So this whole concept of having these small, intimate elements being the centerpiece of a larger, big, epic story is something that we've seen a lot in the past few films that we've looked at. We've looked at Inception, where the fundamental centerpiece of that is Dom and his guilt about his wife's death, and that sort of takes him through the whole entire movie, and is the centerpiece of that story. And then you, of course, have Aldrin and The Last Samurai, and his relationship with Kasimoto is really at the centerpiece of that whole entire film. And with this one, again, it's that relationship between the father and the daughter that's really at the centerpiece of the whole entire epic story. So, and the music also replicates that. These small ideas then are at the center point of these bigger ideas. So let's talk about the origins of the Interstellar score. So many of you are probably familiar with the one-page story. Back during the press season of Interstellar in 2014, he talked about this quite a bit, and he's talked about it in many interviews since, but he's probably better at describing it than I am, so I'm going to send it off to him.
He gave me this one page, typewritten, old typewriter, thick paper, so I knew there were no carbon copies, and it was just this fable really about being a parent. There were a lot of things in it, really. He knows me pretty well. There were lots of things which we had sort of talked about over dinners. So I wrote the piece, phoned him up Sunday, 9:30 at night. And I said to him, do you want me to send it over? And he goes, no, can you come down? Came down, I played it to him. And so I said, I'm nervous playing things to people, especially when they ask me to write about something very personal. So I sort of looked at him and went, so what do you think? And he goes, suppose I better make the movie. And then I said, what is the movie? And that was a good way to start, because it was, it was very small. I mean, then he told me, it's this huge epic space and all these sort of things. And at one point I interrupted him, I'm going, but look, all I've done is I've written you this fragile, really personal tune. How does this all fit in? He goes, well, I now know where the heart of the story is.
Because my dad promised me.
I'm here now, Murph. I'm here.
So one thing that's been talked about quite a bit with Interstellar is the sound, and more specifically the level of the sound. And so Hans, Richard King, Christopher Nolan have talked about it quite a bit. And in general, what Christopher Nolan has said is that this experimental approach centers around the concept that not only can music be supporting dialogue, but dialogue can also be supporting music. And at certain points in the movie, you'll see that this exchange is going on. So like the first part you'll probably notice is during the cornfield scene. The music is super, super loud and super intense. And then probably one of the next times you'll notice it is when the spaceship is taking off and everything just gets super in your face. And there's definitely an exchange of sound design. Like during that scene, when he's driving on the road, the music is super loud, but then when it cuts to the spaceship sound design, Richard King, it's super, super loud. And this is always exchanging. So I think that the whole approach to sound, this experimental approach, is super, super interesting. And here's Hans talking about this element.
Well, we never tried to alienate an audience. What we were trying to do is we were intentionally being bold, because that's what we felt we needed to be. I mean, be bold or go home. Let's make the movie we want to make. Let's just, this is, let's stand by our decision, which is absolutely what we did. And I think the dub, just on a technical level, was pushing the technology of what a cinema and what a speaker and anything can handle.
So the first thing you'll probably notice is the prominent use of the organ to describe the humanity and technological advancements of mankind. We also have an unusually large woodwind ensemble with the prominent use of extended articulations. I think it was one time during one of the recording sessions that Richard Harvey said something like, "I think these musicians trained their entire lives to not play like this." We also have the subtle use of electronics. We have two main synthesizers used, the Zebra synthesizer from Yuhi, and then, I hope I pronounce this right, I probably won't, but the Jonte Euphonium or something like that. We then have the use of a 60-voice mixed choir performing extended articulations, and this was recorded facing away from the microphones to create a very ghostly, reverberated tone. You might also notice that there's lots of morphing between various elements throughout the score, so it might go from like a clarinet to a clarinet organ sound, or from a soft synth to an organ, and that creates a lot of blending between various elements. We also have the preservation of natural reverb decays, and in one of the interviews, Hans said that Christopher Nolan was actually commonly extending shots to allow for reverbs to naturally decay. Also, there was no spotting session, and it was written in parallel with the film's production over a span of 2 years. The first thing that we have is a 4-stop pipe organ made by Harrison & Harrison, and this is of course located at the Temple Church in London, which we'll talk about in the next segment. And then we have 36 strings, a string quartet and piano quartet recorded at Air. We also have 24 woodwinds, which would include 6 flutes, 4 oboes, 6 clarinets, and 4 bassoons, and that includes the auxiliary instruments like English horn, contrabassoon, and the bass clarinet. We also have a brass ensemble. The number and setup is unknown. And then in addition, we also have a 60-piece choir, which is the London Voices. In terms of soloists, we have Roger Sayer on the organ, Hans Zimmer did the piano solos, we have Anne-Marie Simpson on the violin, who also did the violin work on Man of Steel. Now, Frank Ricotti, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, he was on the tune percussion, and you might recognize him from the Spitfire Audio sample library. And the next one, Skalila Kanga, you might also recognize from the Spitfire Audio harp library. Synth programming was by Hans, and then ambient music design was by Mario Rinch. So in terms of the main team, we have Hans's assistant Steve Mazzaro on sequencing. We have Andrew Kaczynski, who's done tons of additional music work for Remote Control Productions projects, and he's also on sequencing. We have Gavin Greenaway, who's conducted pretty much every one of Hans's scores, and he also conducted for the World of Hans Zimmer tour. And then we also have Richard Harvey, who you might recognize as being one of the early mentors of Harry Gregson Williams, and he's also written additional music work on the Da Vinci Code, Inferno, and done a lot of ethnic work on scores including The Lion King. So the pipe organ is the largest musical instrument created by man, and it's been around in its current form since around the 14th century. And it's made up of one or more pipe divisions that's played either with the hands using the keyboard or with the feet using the pedal. And really what it does is it sends pressurized air to a certain set of pipes, creating different sounds. So there's 3 main categories of these stops. There's pedal, grate, and swell. And some of the sounds would include bassoon, trombone, clarinet, tuba, there's sub-bass sounds, there's flutes, etc. So it's super, super versatile, and that's what makes it such an extraordinary instrument. So really what characterizes an organ sound is the building. It's how the organ speaks. And if you put one organ in tons of different buildings, it's going to sound different depending on the building's acoustics. And Temple Church in London is such a historic building. It was actually built all the way back during the Knights Templar. And so it's super old, super historical, and you can almost hear that in the sound. And the organ has over 3,000 pipes, so it's massive, and there's tons of sonic possibilities. And so it's a perfect organ, I think, and it sounds really, really great in the score. So the organ is used for 2 main reasons in Interstellar. First of all, it represents human beings' achievement in engineering. It's the largest musical instrument ever created, and Interstellar is all about pushing the boundaries of science and pushing the boundaries of humankind and what we can actually achieve. And so it's perfect for that element. Next one is, even though it isn't a religious film, there's still this thing about the organ that represents human beings trying to connect with something that we don't totally understand, since it's usually in churches and it represents that aspect of it. And it's perfect for Interstellar because it's all about delving into things that we don't completely understand, like especially the third act of the movie with the Tesseract and with these alternate dimensions and the connection that gravity has throughout the universe. These are things that we sort of theorize in our heads, but things that we don't totally understand. And I think that the organ represents that aspect of the story perfectly. So here's one of the organs that we used in the suite, and this is made by a company called Hoptwerk, and they've sampled dozens of organs from all around the world. And not only have they sampled these organs, but they have super deeply sampled each one of these organs. So every single stop, they've really captured the room and the tone of each one of these organs, which individually they all sound totally different. So this is of course the free version, but if you want to get one of the other organs, they come in different parts, and if you want to get all the different stops, you have to buy all the parts, and each part is around $400. So the organ that Hans used to mock up a lot of the organ stuff in Interstellar was the Salisbury organ, and that comes in 3 various parts. Each is $400. So it's a little pricey, but at the same time you are getting so much, and you really are capturing that sound of the organ. Hopwork is pretty cool. I had absolutely no idea about it before I did the Interstellar behind the score, so this sort of exposed me to Hopwork. But if you're looking for like a really legit sounding organ that sounds super realistic and is really playable and is has all the different features that you need from an actual organ, Hopwork is certainly the way to go. So here's the second organ that we use, and this is from Spitfire Audio. It's called the Union Chapel organ, and I use this primarily for the softer stuff. So for a lot of the choir stops, this is just the clarinet stop. So here's the third and final organ. I use this mainly for a lot of the loud, bright organ sounds, and this is a patch called the Pipe Organ Cathedral, and it's from Omnisphere, just from the stock sound collection. And when you load it up, it comes with this reverb sound, so I just got rid of that. It also adds a bit of a delay. And it doesn't sound ultra realistic on its own, but when you put it in context with the Hopwork organ and the Union Chapel organ, it works super well to deliver that really bright organ sound. So the recording process for Interstellar is actually pretty interesting, because part of it was recorded at Air Studios in London, and part of it was recorded at Temple Church in London, where the organ is. So the church contains 2 different organs, and the 4-stop organ used in the score is the Harrison & Harrison organ, and that was built in 1942, and that specific organ has 3,828 different pipes. And for the recording of the organ at Temple Church, one set of mics were placed 20 feet away, and the other set were placed approximately 40 feet away. And Roger Sayer, who was the organist on Interstellar, has also been the church organist since 2014. So though most of the orchestral sessions were held at Temple Church, there was also a few things that were recorded at Air Studios, including the piano quartet. So let's talk about some of the thematic material in Interstellar. So the first thing is the main theme of the film. This is the first thing I would assume that Hans wrote, and this is the Murph and Cooper theme. It's pretty much built off a F major 7, E minor first inversion, and then A minor. And that's what has that rising quality. We talked a little bit about those, first inversion chords in Last Samurai. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that, go check out the theme gallery part of Last Samurai. So the next theme is called the Earth theme, and here is that. And you might also call this one like the stay theme, but the reason why I call it the Earth theme is because it reminds me of, it has a certain sense of longing to it. And I think because in the movie Earth is Dying, it really represents that aspect really well. And it's usually accompanying scenes that are taking place on Earth, like the intro scene, and then the scene where it transitions from Earth to space when the rocket takes off. And that's why I like to call it the Earth theme. But it could also be used as the stay theme, or as like the theme representing Murph's loss of when her father sort of takes off. Next one is called the space theme. So the next theme is a really great theme in the movie, and it's called the anomaly theme, and it happens when sort of mysterious things are happening having to do with gravity or things like that. And it's also a major part of the score that was not on the soundtrack. the final soundtrack. It's on the complete score, but it's pretty much when they first get up into space and they're sort of moving around the spaceship, and it's a very, very heavy part of that initial space sequence that wasn't on the soundtrack, but it's a super, super great musical element. So here's just a little bit of that. And so you can see it has a super, super Wagner feel to it, like sort of the Tristan piece. All those sort of like semitone suspensions that are just sort of like, and then they resolve. So I think it's perfect for the whole anomaly type thing, and it has this mysterious quality of something that, is happening but we don't completely understand. So there's the four main thematic elements of the movie, and of course the most prominent one is the Murphy Cooper theme, because it represents, again, that heart of the story, and it represents the link that's sort of like threaded through the whole entire film and threaded through the whole entire score. So it's definitely a wonderful theme that describes that relationship super, super well. So there's just a little look into the thematic material. So let's start off with the beginning of the movie. So we open with this interesting array of earthly soundscapes. So we have rain, thunder, we have a storm, crickets, waves, aggressive wind, and I've taken all these different layers and I've sort of automated them to weave in and out of each other so that no one element is at sort of the top. Everything is just melded into each other. And so this is how that sounds on its own. So that goes on for pretty much the whole entire first piece. And one thing that we do have that's pretty interesting is Hans ended up using the wave as a sort of transitional element, which is pretty interesting, actually. So another thing that we have is we of course have the organs happening throughout this whole entire piece, which is pretty much our first introduction to the main sound palette of the whole entire movie. The clarinet stop comes in on a C, and then the piccolo stops come in on like a B flat, so we pretty much have the suspension created, and then the organ comes in on F, so we have like an F sus4, and then it goes to a F major, and then it repeats again, and it goes to minor as a bit of a dark tone. And it has this sense of longing and desperation, like something that was once great and filled with, all this opportunity and resources like Earth in the movie has, somehow gotten to this dark place. And I think that going from the major to the minor really, really helps to carry that message. When we get to this next section here, we have this big sort of boom, and it's made by three different synth layers. We have this sub bass that then is part of the rest of the piece, and then we have the sub boom hit, which sounds like this. And then we have a big impact from Ombrisphere. So that's all that's really happening there. So then we have something called the Hopwork swell, and then we have a Hopwork organ noise. So you can see this layer here is almost like a soundscape in an interesting way, and then this is more of a bass sound. And then you can see our organ pad has sort of doubled here, so we have a much thicker sound. So he's constantly weaving in, major and minor. So we just have this like, second suspension, major second suspension, and then he brings in a minor third, and we're sort of confused on what is bright and what is dark. And I think that really creates a really, really neat environment. And you can see the flute stops come in here, and that's what's playing that lower sound. Minor again. And this is pretty much when he approaches the window, and you see outside, and you see all the corn, and you see sort of the sun shining, and then we get this huge, ginormous. If you were in the movie theater when you saw this movie, you'll probably know what I'm talking about, because it's the first time where you're sort of like, holy crap, and the sound just hits you like this huge, awesome brick wall of musical greatness. And so this is what that sounds like. Lots of fun. And then we have this next cue called Chasing Drone, and this is 1M2, and this is in the movie when they are chasing the satellite drone through the cornfield. And this is a pretty awesome cue because it constantly has movement all throughout the piece. You can see just the MIDI content. Everything is weaving in and out of each other, and if I just select the MIDI here, you can see there's lots of movement in and out, lots of short notes as well. So I think I'll just start off by playing just the organ so you can hear what that sounds like on its own. So pretty much the main melody is made up of multiple different layers. So the first layer is the clarinet stop. It's a very, very soft, subtle sound, a very choral sound. And then we have the flute come in. Gives it a brighter quality. And then we have this next element, which is the organ lead. Which just gives it a bigger sound. And all those three together layered sounds like this. So then we have this harmonic bed played by a sort of big, great stop. And that's being doubled by the flute stop. Which gives it a sort of warmer, sweeter tone. And all that together sounds like this. So we're pretty much starting on F major 7, then we're going to E minor first inversion, and then to A minor, back to E minor first inversion, and then it's just repeating that. So it's pretty simple harmonically, but as you can see, all the different layers involved, especially in the next section, that's really what gives it its complexity. All the various voices moving in different directions and really creating this huge, huge cloud of all these different sounds and textures. So the first thing that we have is the Concertino patch from Spitfire Chamber Strings. That's sort of my go-to for everything lush strings, and it works really, really well. This is what that sounds like on its own. So then we have Oliver Arnold's Chamber Evolutions, just playing some very simple root notes. It's actually playing the third of the chords. And then we have these longer notes. Oops. playing the bass. And all that together sounds like this. So this next little section, or what I like to call the bridge here, is one that took me quite a while to figure out, because there's a lot of things sort of going on at one point, but it's a lot of like weird rhythmic things that are weaving in and out of each other and creating a really interesting texture. So let's just look at all the different layers of this specific section. So we start off with the marimbas, and we have one that's playing like an arpeggio, then one that's playing this minor second figure, and that sounds like this on its own. And I've put on an auto pan, and they're pretty much set at the rhythm that the figures are playing in, so that it really has an interesting sound that constantly feels like it's moving around, which adds to the overall texture. And then we have the pianos and the harp, so let's just take it layer by layer. Here's the first one. You can see it's just hitting on the quarter notes. Then we have this arpeggio. And then another arpeggio. And then another arpeggio in the harp mutes. And finally we have a piccolo stop. Here's what that sounds like. Oops. And that's just coming out of the right. So now we're on to sort of like the big section of the piece. So let's take it section by section and just look at what's going on in this big texture. So first things first is we just have this simple percussion, hit that's happening every now and then. And then we have, of course, our strings, and we have, again, the concertina patch playing the main harmony. We have the Ólafur Arnalds, again, adding to the overall sonic interest of the string section. And then we have a bass patch just playing the bass. And then in terms of our keyboard, so first things first is we have this one. So you can see that this is moving downwards. Same thing with this one. While our main melody is moving upwards, so it creates that contrary motion sound. And then we have the Metropolis Arc 2 A3 pianos sort of playing a lot of these different. And the thing that I love about these is that they're super contextual. They work super, super well in big arrangements and really just blend into it. And they have a really, really big sound. And of course, in Interstellar, a lot of the pianos was played by a piano quartet. So it has a really, really big, big sound to it. So we also have this constant downwards chord motion arpeggio. And then we have the harp. The first thing that we have is, of course, doubling the melody a couple octaves up. Then we bring in another harp layer. And then we bring in the mutes. that's what we have going on there. And then in terms of the organs, so let's just take a look at what we have going on. So we of course have the main melody being played by the clarinet stop. So here's what that sounds like. Doubled by the piccolo. Then we have our first harmonic bed. Second one. And then we have all the other rhythmic stuff. So we have, for example, we have this one, which is the sort of main principal great stop, creating a lot of that movement. So when this comes in, we pretty much have... And then playing in conjunction with that, we have this. Which is a little bit more random, but them both together works really, really well. Creates a lot of interesting, voices moving in different directions, a lot of sort of interesting textural stuff. So then we have this hop work under bass, or under bass, I guess that's a misspelling. Here's what that sounds like. It has a really cool room sound to it, and it really adds a lot of presence to the organ department. Then we come in with this other harmonic bed being played by the pipe organ. So it has a huge, again, big bright sound, and that's of course the Omnisphere organ. And so, yeah, that's pretty much what we have going on in the organ section in this specific piece. So let's move on to Combines Went Haywire. So Combines Went Haywire is really centered around this tritone. We have this C. Here, let me just pull up a string patch here. C. And usually you'd hear that as being like the devil's interval. That's what they used to call it. But in this case, it has a super, super mysterious sound to it. You can see that there's this very, very Wagner feel to it, this very sort of big, wide, open sound. And this is made by having these strings being doubled with the oboe and octave above, creates that really, really cool sound. And then we have an English horn in there as well. And then we, of course, have the flutes creating that very nice sort of environment. And so... And I barely ever used the bass flute, but I found it was a pretty good opportunity to do that. I don't know if they actually used it in the score, but it creates a really, really cool sound. And here is what that sounds like. So here's all that together. So we have this Hans Zimmer strings patch on the main melody. It has a pretty neat wide sound to it. And then we have the Hans Zimmer strings again, the Collegno Trotto 60 cellos. And then we have some tremolos, and we have Oliver Arnold's Chamber Evolutions. And these are, of course, since this is the waves, they are a limited sort of timing. So they're really just accent based. And then we have Hans Zimmer strings again, Concertino tremolo. And then, of course, Berlin Orchestra Inspire. Almost missed that one. And that's what we have going on in these strings. And then apart from that, that's actually all that's happening. So let me just play all that together. So in the thematic section, we talked about the docking cue and how it's always sort of usually used in space or during like very dark, mysterious moments. And it's really characterized by this interesting sort of fluttering sound, which is then doubled with some weird sort of choral effects. And in this case, I just used a patch from Omnisphere, and that's all just doubled with some tremolos, which is just on the root. And pretty much what we're doing is we're doing like a major second suspension, D and E. Now for the percussion, let's take a look at what's going on here. So we have these brushes. And we've gone in, we've taken all the low end out, and if we were to keep all the low end in, it actually has a drum under there. But I just wanted the brush aspect of that specific patch, so I just cut it out using EQ. So here's that. Finally, we get to this next section, and we bring in a piano. Again, it's just on the root, and it's playing on the quarter notes. And that's just the Metropolis Arc 2 piano. And then finally we bring in some Calegnos. As well as a flute organ stop. And then we bring in this C major chord, which is played by the clarinets. So that second section together sounds like this. And we're also adding in just a bass drum and a tom just to intensify the percussion. So this is used all throughout the movie, but the instance that we chose is when they first get into space and they're docking on the Endurance. And so it has a bit of a mysterious vibe, but it isn't necessarily threatening at all. But when we get further into the movie, then we're beginning to, the stakes are getting higher. So for example, when we go into the black hole, or we get near Saturn and we're actually going further and further and further, this specific theme evolves and gets a bit darker and is used in a variety of different ways. But that's just a little bit about docking. So this next cue, No Time for Caution, is for a lot of people their favorite cue in the whole movie, and I could totally see why. It's super, super intense, super, super energetic. So we're going to be taking a look at really what makes up this cue, and there are quite a bit of layers when it comes to the sort of big, meaty section. So we'll just take it sort of, section by section and check out how everything is built. So for this ticking clock sound, I pretty much took a sample of a ticking clock, brought it into Cubase, lined everything up. I did some automation so that it had actually a sense of like a sort of percussive feel. So it starts out, and then there's a gradual build for each quarter note in between, so that it feels less static than just going tick, 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 you know what I mean? So it has a much less sort of repetitive machine gun feel to it. So next we have this sort of organic organ pad that we had at the beginning of the suite, and just some sort of environmental stuff. It's pretty simple. You can see we have this environmental wind, which quickly has become one of my favorite sort of sound effects sort of patches, because you can put it under anything and it really just adds this sense of space and the sense of air. And so you can see just in this situation, it really does do something interesting. Okay, so for this next section, let's start off with the organs. So what we're doing is we're pretty much in A minor. So we have this E in the bass. So here it is. So we're pretty much playing an A minor chord, but we just have the fifth in the bass, so it's a second inversion chord. But then later in the track, we actually go to E minor, so that pretty much states that we've been in E minor the whole time. We've just been playing, the 4. So it's relatively simple. We just start out with A minor, then E minor, and then at the end of the track, we eventually go to the key of A minor, C major. So we have quite a few organs happening during this specific section. So let's just start out here. So the organ pad continues, and then we have what I would call the melody, I would say. And then we have the exact same thing, but on a different organ. This is a much more brighter, aggressive organ. Then we have our bass. And all that together sounds like this. So super spacious and big. And then another thing that we have that is relatively, I couldn't totally pick it up in the actual score. I don't know whether they threw like distortion on an organ or something like that, but there's like this distortion big strum below everything, and it might just be like a super aggressive piano sample that they distorted or something, but I couldn't totally tell. So I figured a guitar actually worked relatively well under everything, just to add that element. So you can't really tell it's a guitar, but it just adds that sound. And then for the synths, we have this sub bass. And then again, our atmospheric wind comes in during this section. And then for the pianos, we pretty much have these big sort of impacts here. So here's that. So those are pretty much playing eighth notes, and then we have another piano pretty much replicating exactly what these two organs are doing here. Just with some slight variations to make it a little bit more interesting, so it's not just sort of like a copy and paste situation. We have just a little bit of this just creates a little bit of space over this. And in the case of Interstellar, there's so much going on at any one point, especially in a section like this. So, there could be brass and then woodwinds and then choir and everything like that. So you sort of have to do the math and see how each specific section interacts with other sections. That begins to show you how everything is sort of built. It's sort of confusing, but it just takes some experimentation. And this specific section was probably the most difficult section. This took me something like 4 or 5 days or something to totally get down. And then for strings short, we have a few things going on. We have Metropolis Arc 3 for the quarter notes. Then we have another Metropolis Arc 3 having more of like a rhythmic pulse. And then Hans Zimmer cellos is really our main rhythmic pulse for the strings short. Oops. And then, of course, Metropolis Arc continues. And then we have this super, super loud accent here on bar one, looks like 140, first beat. Or second beat. And that just sort of comes out of nowhere, but it's in the original recording, so... And then we have some hits, and we're pretty much just using Hans Zimmer percussion, these low booms. Then when we get to the next section, that's when we're using a lot more. So we have these. We'll talk over that in a second. And then for even more percussion, we're just continuing the low drums and the toms, so the bass drum and then the toms from the last cue, which was docking. So we're just continuing that and using that as a thread to tie the two pieces together. Then we have a little bit of brass going on, nothing too aggressive, but I think bass trombones were a really, really good addition just to give this piece a little bit more grit. And you can see how Hans sort of used these bass trombones to sort of meld in with the much more aggressive side of the lower range of the organ. They're just sort of melding together and creating one texture, sort of like the morphing that we were talking about. You know, you have different elements sort of sinking into each other and creating sort of larger elements. So that's sort of what we have going on in this specific section. So here's that. Another thing I forgot is these tremolos here. You'll hear those in the original recording as well. And I had to throw some automation on there just to make it sound exactly like it was in the recording. It sort of like has these impacts and then they sort of die down. So moving on to this next section, which is pretty big and loud. So here's this one. So the main thing in this piece is these string marcatos, or you can call them portados as well, but they needed to have a certain impact and sort of like a slap in the face feel to them. So the portato articulation from Metropolis Arc 1 worked perfectly for that feel. So that is sort of like the center point, I would say, of the main, you know, the main feel of the whole entire piece. So then when it comes to these sort of percussion hits, we have a few different layers. So we have these brushes that are hitting on the quarter notes. And again, it's the exact same brush they were using earlier during, I think it was docking. And then we have these low booms that are just sort of these build-in hits. Well, that would actually be these guys. And this is actually from Metropolis Arc 1. And what I did is I went in and I added on a compressor, as well as I just took out all the low end. So it sounds like this without. So took that away, added a little bit of high end without. It sounds like this. But I just wanted to give it a little bit more of a cutting sound to it. And then we have this next and final percussion layer, which are like Grand Casas from, I think, Majestica or something. I don't totally know if I'm right. I think it could be. All right. Yeah, it's Majestica, so low percussion, Grand Casas. So for the strings, we already talked about these marcados, and that's really the main thing that's happening in the strings, other than the caleños, which are continuing. And then we have more caleños, and they're pretty much just doing like these 16th notes. And then this one. Again, just the more aggressive Metropolis Arc 1 Kalenyas. So that's what's happening there. And then going into the choirs. So this is one that I added fairly towards the end of the whole entire project during the revisions phase, because I felt that there was something that was tying this whole section together that I couldn't totally notice. And I realized if you listen super, super, super closely, you can notice this faint choir in the background. And of course, the way that it was mic'd, you know, with them facing away from the microphone, it's very hard to pick it up very, very clearly. So you really have to pay attention for that. But you can notice a choir in this piece. And if I'm wrong on that, definitely call me out for it. I didn't have the scores or anything, so just basing it off of my ear. But for the next one, we have quite a bit of piano action happening that is really working in coalition with the organs, rhythmically speaking. So first thing we have is this one. You can probably hear the auto pan in there. And there is quite a bit of, again, automation going on in here just to make sure that everything is sort of weaving in and out of each other. Because Interstellar is, again, all about the morphing of all these various elements. They're coming in and out of each other, and different things are sticking their head above the water at certain points. And nothing is ever at one sort of equilibrium. I think everything is sort of coming in and out of each other. And definitely for this cue, we have so much stuff going on that if everything was playing at the exact same volume all the time, it would get a little bit straining to your ears. So we have all these different elements doing their things. So and then we have these big chords, which are of course copying what the portatos are doing, and then one final So in terms of the organ, you can just see how much sort of rhythmic stuff is happening. And each one of these things are not doing, the same thing. None of these are copied from anything else. Each one of these is sort of functioning as its own sort of beast. So this first one is from the Union Chapel organ, and this is really just taking care of a lot of like the really, really high-end rhythmic stuff. We actually have one patch that's taking care of even an octave above that, which is, I believe it's this one. Yeah. And then you heard probably this one in the pianos, which is taking care of a bit more like the midsection. These big impacts, which are of course doubling the marcato / portato strings. And then finally, we have the more lower end. We have our bass, again, Union Chapel organ. And that is really all that we have going on in the case of the organ in this piece. And then, we bring in a little bit more of the sort of interstellar natural sounds that we get in the Earth theme. And we just brought in a little bit of the wind, a little bit of the water. Which again, he's using these sort of natural sounds as transitional elements, which sounds like this contextually. Apart from that, we just have more bass trombones, and that is really all that's going on in this section, other than, again, sub bass, and then the atmospheric wind, and another low pad, which sounds like this on its own. Which is in its way just another sub bass. So for this next section, I've gone in and I've just raised the hull noise of the track up just a little bit. And for example, when we play the solo piano and we have the hull noise on versus when it's off. So here's with it on. Now if you remove it, it's just going to sound... This almost just sounds too clean, like they actually went in and cleaned up the samples, which I'm sure they probably did. And so we're using, again, a similar configuration to the piano quartet that they used in the film, which is 3 pianos, but they use 4 in real life. You can see what we have going on. We have F, D, which is pretty much creating this diminished chord. This is C minor, A flat major, and they have this like really cool suspension here to a minor. Dominant, then back to the tonic. So one scene in the movie that has really stuck with me, I mean, the wave scene was awesome. I mean, the scene in the black hole was awesome. The scene in the wormhole was awesome near Saturn. That was all super, super cool and brilliantly executed and well done. But the scene at the end with Murph and Cooper in the hospital room just has this beautiful emotional tension to it that I don't think I've ever seen, in film the exact same way. And it really is just an extraordinary scene. And given the circumstances of what's happened throughout the whole movie, that he left his daughter and he's actually interacting with his daughter who is, decades older than him. And, he eventually got done what he needed to get done, but that was at the sacrifice of his relationship with his daughter throughout her whole entire life. So it's super emotional. And I think that this specific scene, and specifically this moment that happens here on, bar 175, where we finally get to that F major chord after being on this very sort of unstable point throughout the whole entire piece. Like we have this E in the bass, which is pretty much an A minor first inversion or second inversion. And putting the 5th in the bass of any chord gives a little bit of unstableness to it. But when we finally get to this F major chord, it sinks and it just sounds incredible. So we pretty much brought in one more organ voice, which is this clarinet voice. Well, actually, we brought in 2, as well as this one patch from the stock Contact library. So the ending of the movie uses a reprise of the Cornfield Chase cue, but it's more like the second half of that piece, much bigger, more intense, and we introduced a whole lot more stuff happening in the pianos. So, here's what all that sounds like together. So just all the different layers, we have, oops. So the thing that I love so much about this final piece is pretty much the thing that I love about the final piece of Inception, Time. And, Time, for example, ends on this mysterious D major chord. And it ends just with this mystery, like, is he still awake? Is he still dreaming? And it leaves that open to the viewer. And the way that Interstellar ends on this E, which leads into the credits, and it asks the question, what happens after the movie concludes? Like, did he make it back to Brand? What happened to Cooper Station? All those questions are sort of left unanswered, which is the thing that I love about the ending of Inception and Interstellar, is that it brings the closure to the story and to the film, but at the same time, it leaves something open, something vague, open, and it really makes the viewer think and really allows the viewer to put their own interpretation of the story and of the future of the story into the film. So let's talk about a few of the technical aspects regarding the suite. So here is all of the automation for the suite. So you can see there's a few things going on behind the scenes. And so my sort of programming philosophy is I like to pay attention to each individual track very, very closely. A lot of the times when we're programming, it's very tempting to pull up a track, put in the MIDI info, move on, keep building. But I really like to take my time with each individual track and really focus on everything, because it really gives you the most realism and the most control over how everything interacts with each other. And it really doesn't take that much more time to focus in on every track. Usually you just go through, you do an automation pass, you focus on the modulation, expression, all that type of stuff, and then just a quick EQ that you throw on to make sure everything's blending well and interacting with each other. And it shouldn't take too long, depending on how complex this specific track is and how timbrally interesting or difficult that specific one is to treat. So for example, let me find a good one. Here we go. So let me pull up this one, this specific track. So you can see we just have some simple sort of chords. So if we were to remove the automation, it would sound like this. Which, does it sound bad or awful? Not really, but it also doesn't sound expressive. It doesn't sound like an organ player is sitting there with the foot expression pedal and playing it like one normally would. So adding on just that little bit of detail really, really helps, especially when you do it all over the place. So when you do it with all the individual tracks and make each of them sound personalized and different, they interact with each other a lot better. So that's all that we really have going on in terms of the automation. So in terms of sample libraries that I'm using, so all the woodwinds are pretty much Berlin Woodwinds and Metropolis Arc 2, because they have that bass flute and alto flute, and that's pretty helpful. I'm using a bit of Berlin Orchestra Inspire just for these wood longs throughout the Combines Went Haywire cue, and that's all I'm using that for. And then we have Spitfire Percussion Redux for all of the traditional orchestral percussion, and then Metropolis Arc 3 and Hans Zimmer Percussion for all of the bigger percussion. So for the strings, I'm using Hans Zimmer strings, Spitfire chamber strings, Oliver Arnold's Chamber Evolutions, Spitfire Mural, and each of these are sort of blending in with each other. I'm using a bit of Metropolis Arc 1 for the No Time for Caution cue, because I needed something a bit more aggressive. And then when it comes to tremolo, usually I'm always, guided back towards the Berlin Orchestra Inspired tremolos, because they just sound super, super good. You can see they have that natural noise on them, and contextually it just sounds really good. And then I'm using Mural for a bit of the sort of bigger tremolos, and then Metropolis Arc 1 for the lower, and then Hans Zimmer strings has some really, really nice concertino tremolos that are just sort of fluttering in and out of Combines Went Haywire and just sort of replicating what the melody is doing. So all that we're using in the choirs is Omnisphere, just the stock Omnisphere patches. So most of the pianos in this specific suite is the Pianos A3 from Metropolis Arc 2. It's just incredibly good sounding, especially contextually, and it has that Interstellar piano sound because it's, of course, 3 pianos, and Interstellar was 4 pianos, but 3 does the job quite well. And so then I'm using Alicia's keys, a couple instances of Winchester piano, which is a recent library from, I believe it's Fracture Sounds, and James Everingham. And then we have the felt piano from Spitfire Audio. And so that's what we have going on in the piano section. I'm also using some hall noise from Una Corda. And then for harps, I'm using the Berlin Orchestra Inspire harp for a bit more of the accompanying harp. And then I'm using the Angelic harp for the more lead harp. And then for the synths, we have a little bit of Albion 3 Iceni for the sub bass, and the patch that I always use, I believe, is like the Moog. Or it's actually the Juno, so I use the Juno sub bass, and that just sits under the brass and the strings to give it a bit more low end. then literally all this stuff is Omnisphere. So Omnisphere makes up probably 80% of all my synth stuff. But then I also do use quite a bit of Hybrid 2 libraries, so Project Alpha, Project Bravo. The Gravity stuff is great, but in this specific suite, I'm using mostly Omnisphere. So we talked about the organs at the beginning of the video, so if you skipped across that section, you should be able to find the time code down below in the pinned comment. And then for the interstellar sounds, I just took different sounds that I found online of rain, thunder, storms, crickets, and mixed those all together. Thanks so much for watching today's episode, and most importantly, thank you so much for your guys' feedback and recommendations, and for being a part of Behind the Score. And film music analysis in general really teaches us a lot about how so many different people approach the same thing, and that is telling stories with music. And we learned so much about different approaches, not only technically, how they approach harmony, orchestration, all that type of stuff, but also intellectually how they approach, really connecting their music with that specific story. And with each one of these, we really learned something totally different. And with Interstellar, it really is about the subtlety. It's about that very strong emotional center point that really connects absolutely everything in the story, and that keeps everything linked, and it really ties this thread through the whole story. And there's definitely something to be learned from this whole approach. It's that the heart of the story can sometimes really accentuate the grandness of the story. So I will be in Vienna, Austria all of July for the Hollywood Music Workshop, and if any of you guys are going, to put that down below. I'd love to see you there. But I won't be able to make huge videos like this, but I will try to get out a few smaller videos, whether that's quick tips or vlogs around the city of Vienna, showing off some of the musical stuff. But I've always wanted to sort of see a European city. I've never left the U.S. before, so it'll be my first time, outside the U.S., but also in Europe. And I am going to try to share that with you guys. If you guys have any recommendations for future videos, whether that's shorter videos or longer Behind the Score episodes, please do put that down below. And if you guys have any additional questions regarding today's episode, please do also attach that below, and I will definitely get back to you on that. So thank you guys so much for watching today's episode, and if you guys did enjoy it, please do subscribe and share. I would truly appreciate it. But anyways, thank you so much, and I will see you guys next time.